All right, welcome everyone. My name is Emily Bell. I'm the communications coordinator for the Florida Wildflower Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, The Soil Food Web. Hopefully you're asking yourself what that's all about and what it means. We're going to dive into that soon. For those of you not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through education, research, planting, and conservation programs. Our work is made possible primarily through the sales and renewals of the Florida State Wildflower License Plate. You can see here, this is our old look. We've had a new plate on the road for a number of years now. These funds, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native plants and wildflowers throughout Florida, as well as get plants in the ground through different planting projects and much more. We'd like to encourage those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the State Wildflower License Plate. And if you purchase or have the plate, you are eligible for membership. So just let us know you have the tag and we'll get you set up. Also, be sure to check out our website. We've got tons of resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where you can see wildflowers in bloom, to keep up with our events. And you can also find us on social media. We're at FLA Wildflowers on most platforms. We do not have a webinar coming up for May. In lieu of that, we are very excited to be hosting field trips across the state in May. We do have one coming up this weekend at Ecological Lowlands Preserve, which is a property of the Coastal Plains Institute, and Ryan Means, the president of that organization, will be our guide into the preserve, sharing how their management practices have produced a botanical haven for many of the Florida Panhandle's endemic, endangered, and threatened wildflowers. So we still have a few spots open for that, so feel free to join us. And then in May, on May 4th, we will be teaming up with the Florida Native Plant Society and the Nature Conservancy to visit another landscape similar to the Lowlands Preserve that is actually typically closed to the public, which is Rock Hill Preserve. It features some really unique habitats in the Florida Panhandle near Chipley, Florida. So we're really excited to be visiting and hosting that field trip. On May 11th, we're teaming up with Crew to visit the Crew Marsh near Immokalee, Florida. And on May 11th and 12th are our annual Wildflower Farm Field Days, and that's in Alachua, which is near Gainesville, Florida. That's in partnership with Florida Wildflowers Incorporated and the Florida Wildflower Growers Association, and you'll get to visit a working wildflower farm and see how they harvest and grow wildflowers and produce seed for commercial purposes. It's a really great opportunity. And we have 2 days. You can come Saturday or Sunday. Oh, I lost my cursor there. There we go. So really quick, just before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. All attendees are muted with cameras off. If you have questions as we go along, which we certainly hope you will, please submit those via the Q&A feature at any point during the presentation, and we'll take questions at the end. If your question isn't answered, you can email it to us at info@FLAwildflowers.org. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on both our YouTube channel and website in approximately 24 hours. And if you registered, you'll receive an email with the link to it. But again, for questions, please be sure to submit those in the Q&A feature and not in the chat, as we are not monitoring the chat for questions. You're welcome to use the chat for other purposes. So with that, let's jump right in. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, George, or Geo Debs. He's an ecological landscape designer and certified soil food web lab technician. He's traveled around the world cultivating his passion for ecological design through community regenerative agriculture. He's resided in Southeast Florida for the last 6 years and has really grown to love the state's unique and beautiful ecosystems. He loves sharing his knowledge of botany and soil biology with gardeners and really anyone interested in those areas and deepening his knowledge through hands-on practice and empirical studies. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gio.
Thank you for that introduction. Hi, I hope everyone's doing great today. Thank you so much for having me and for signing on. As Emily said, my name is Gio, and my company is Terrazoa Inc. Yeah, I'm an ecological designer. I've been working in the field for almost 10 years. And several years ago, I became a certified soul food web lab technician under Dr. Elaine Ingham, who some of you may or may not know, and I'll delve into who she is in a moment, through her soul food web school. So what that basically means is I'm able to take soil samples and I test them and I analyze their soil biology. So we're going to get a better understanding of what all that encompasses and why it's so important. And this is an introductory presentation. So I'm going to share my screen now so we can get into the actual presentation. Yeah, so this is an introductory presentation. Um, it's a very vast topic. There's hours and hours that we could be delving into fleshing out every single subject here. There's a lot of chemistry and biology and ecology, but I'm going to try to keep it as succinct as possible, but also cover as much ground as possible and make it relevant to all of us in our gardens. Yeah, so hopefully by the end of it, we'll all get a better understanding of what the soul food web is and why it's so important, and hopefully open up your eyes and minds to, see the world in a different way, um, and how you interact with your landscape as well. Hopefully starts to shift some of that for you all. I'd also like to thank Emily Bell for thinking of me and asking me to speak here today. And, within the context of Florida Wildflower Foundation, I know there's some people from out of state that are tuning in. Like, the concepts that I'm covering today are relevant no matter where you are. It's across the board. These are ecological concepts that apply to all of us. With that said, we're talking about, native microorganisms, and all of our organisms wherever we live are different from different areas. And it's important to note that, and important to note that they all partner with our specific native plants to our region. That's why it's so important to get into native gardening and to understand our ecosystems and partner with them. And yeah, but even if you're vegetable gardening, this is relevant to you as well. It's relevant to whatever different climate that you're in. So we'll jump into a little outline just to let you know what we'll be covering. So we'll briefly talk about how nature functions, versus conventional agriculture and how it seems to be functioning. What is the soul food web and why it's so important? And then, how we can all start to take deliberate steps in our own landscapes and gardens to restore the soul food web if we don't have it anymore. And then we'll jump into Q&A at the end. So I want to start with, each of you think of a forest. Think of your, favorite place you like to go that's wild. This photo here is from my friend Stephanie Dunn. She was kind enough to share with me. It's inside of a cypress dome. And, think about how much biomass there is in a forest like this, but there's no tilling. There's no, fertilizers that are being applied every season. There's no spraying of anything. It just works. The ecosystem looks after itself, balances itself out, and continually grows and continually decomplexify. Um, Compare that to conventional agriculture. So conventional agriculture tends to be low diversity. It's not very complex. There's very high human inputs. There tends to be soil erosion after a while, and pollution tends to come out of it. And over time, nutrient density decreases, and we end up having issues with yield. But natural systems don't function that way. Human input is not required for them to grow and evolve. Now, I would like to mention that indigenous cultures tend to have a really good synergy with native ecosystems, and they partner really well with them over, thousands of years of coevolution there. But most of society has stepped away from that. It's important to mention that and understand that we could be learning a lot from how indigenous cultures have managed ecosystems and continue to perpetuate them. But technically, we're not required to do anything for nature to do its thing. And These ecosystems continue to support complex life. They self-replicate and they build soil over time rather than erode it. And then water gets filtered and pollutants get filtered over time and yields increase. So, how is it that, nature's able to have this synergy with all these different organisms and continue to complexify with seemingly very minimal inputs? Like, how is that possible? And we're finding that it's actually the soil food web that drives all of this. I'm actually going to move my video here because it's covering my screen a little bit. And so, yeah, we're going to delve into what the soul food web is and how it's relevant to all of us. But before I get into that, I do want to mention Dr. Elaine Ingham. She is my professor, and she is a world-renowned soil microbiologist. She's been in the field for over 40 years, um, and she's a pioneer in soil biology research, basically bringing it to the forefront of agricultural and ecological restoration practices. She was one of the first people to define all these different organisms that we see in the soil and how they um, interact with each other. In 1996, she also opened a soil food web school, and that's a school that I studied with and got certified with. And anyone can join and kind of start their journey on understanding how the soil food web works and why it's so important. So kudos to her for getting me on this path. So jumping right into what the soil food web is, this is the most important diagram. Um, I could give the entire presentation on this diagram, but I will spare you that. Some people call it the a soil biome, and really what it is it's billions of organisms interacting with each other, and creating a balanced ecosystem through those interactions. It's organized via trophic level, which means there's different sizes of organisms, all predating on usually the larger organisms predating on smaller organisms. And it creates this kind of balance and this interaction and exchange of all these different nutrients and exchange of energy between all these organisms. We call it a web because if you remove any one piece of it, it starts to break down the entire system, and there starts to be major imbalances in the whole thing. And plants fit into this as well, and we'll talk about a bit more how that works. So that diagram is kind of an abstraction of what it is. This is a bit more of an illustration of what it looks like under the microscope. So if you were to zoom in, this is what the soil food web looks like. There's inorganic mineral particles, sands, silts, and clays mixed in with organic matter. There's plant roots coming in. There's fungal hyphae kind of webbing through the whole system, and microarthropods and macroarthropods and fungi and bacteria all interacting with each other. So this is what the soil food web basically looks like under the microscope. But this is an illustration, so we want to study it real time, and what we use is microscope. So this is a 40 time magnification of a small piece of moss. And it's a beautiful image, but it's actually not quite large enough for us to actually study the soil food web. So if we zoom in even more to 100x, this is the leaf of the moss, and you can even see the individual cells. But when we're talking the soil organisms, we have to zoom in even more. So most of the studying we do is at 400 times magnification. And there's so much going on in this picture. If it was a video, you'd see things zooming around. And if we have time at the end, we can show some footage of that. Show some footage of that. And there's fungal hyphae here. There's some root hairs. There's microaggregates and humic acids and all this different bacteria moving around. So we'll get into how this all works with our plants. So going back to the original diagram and illustration, essentially, basically, we all know that plants photosynthesize, and they create what we call photosynthates, or carbohydrates, sugars, and proteins. And studies are showing that it depends from species to species, but plants will release up to 80% sometimes of what they produce in their bodies into the root zone. So it begs the question, like, why would a plant waste 80% of what it's producing? That's such a waste of energy. And they're not actually wasting anything. There is billions of years of coevolution here, um, where they have symbiotic relationships with the organisms, and they're exchanging these carbohydrates with these organisms in the rhizosphere, in the root zone of the plants, and on the plant surfaces as well. And this well, this goes to show that there is a really complex system here that we're just starting to scratch the surface and understand how it all works. Um, and plants really are the drivers of this whole system. And we'll delve into what this all means for the plants in our gardens as well. So what's the importance of the soil food web? Well, it offers us all these different benefits. It builds the ecosystem from the ground up, so to speak, and gives us all these different benefits that creates a balanced ecosystem that allows nature to complexify and continually perpetuate the synergy with all these different organisms. So, for example, we'll delve into some of these a bit more, but it helps build soil structure. They retain and cycle nutrients. They suppress diseases. They even can, decompose toxins and pollutants. And ultimately, what they do is they drive succession, and that slide's really exciting. And we'll talk about how that's relevant to our gardens as well. So going back to this little illustration here, um, what happens is there's different niches within the soil that are created for these organisms to survive. So different mineral particles will bind and clump up together through these interactions that these organisms have and create little microclimates for them to survive. So one thing that's important to talk about here is, like, think of bacteria. They're minuscule in size, and if any flood or rain or water that comes through could just wash them away. So why is it that there's such a plethora of bacteria sticking in the soil? And that's because they create what's called alkaline glues, and they glue themselves onto the films of water that cover all these microaggregates in the soil, and they are able to survive by gluing themselves onto these aggregates, onto these mineral particles. Now, the glues actually bind different mineral and organic particles together. And that's where the magic happens. It's when the inorganic material that soil is based on, the soil, the sand, silt, and clay, it starts to it groups up with organic matter, living and dead organic matter, and that's where the magic happens. So the bacteria create alkaline glues that create microaggregates that start to create these little niches within which that they can live and are protected inside. And then fungi come into the system and bind all these microaggregates into macroaggregates, and it creates this lofty texture in the soil that we all really want in our gardens and are familiar with. So if you see this picture over here, if you imagine a raindrop hitting the soil, it'll come right into it. It won't puddle on the soil, it'll get right absorbed into it because there's a lot of organic matter through these interactions that are absorbing the water and creating really nice niches for these organisms to survive in. And what this ultimately does is it creates pockets of air and water for plant roots to enter in, and this is where compaction comes into play. So I have a number here, 150 psi. It's really important to note because plant roots can't penetrate anything above 150 psi. So what I mean by that is when we're talking compaction, it's the density of these aggregates and how densely packed they are. So if they're packed beyond what 150 pounds per square inch can break them apart, plant roots cannot penetrate that. So anything above 150 psi, basically, there's certain plants with tap roots that can penetrate up to 300 psi, but anything beyond that, and most urban environments we're seeing, soil compaction goes way above 300 psi. So what that means is our plant roots are not able to penetrate that soil, and so organisms aren't able to get into there and do all their different functions. So that's really important to know because if you have compaction layers, you're not reaping all the benefits that you could in your garden because a lot of the soil is inaccessible to your plants because it's inaccessible to the plant roots. And so the reason soil biology is so important is because if you have a balanced ecosystem of bacteria and fungi and all their predators, that creates a soil structure that allows air and water to pass through and alleviates the compaction that we're seeing in urban environments. And compaction can happen from walking over an area or from vehicles running over an area, or even just from rain being, hitting exposed soil. And we'll talk a bit more about that later. And so, through all these different interactions, if you have a balanced soil ecosystem, you get increased water holding capacity because the organic content, the organic matter content in the soil increases, and then the soil starts acting like a sponge rather than like concrete. And then what that also does is you get air pockets where oxygen flows through the system. So the reason I'm sticking on the slide a little bit much is this is one of the most important subjects for gardeners. Soil compaction is one of the most detrimental things that can happen in a garden. And if you get this aspect right, most everything else in your garden will function on its own. So it's important to note what aerobic conditions are. So aerobic means that there's high oxygen. So us as humans, we are aerobic organisms. We need oxygen to function chemically, to do the chemical reactions in our bodies, to create the different proteins and enzymes we need to survive. Plants are the same thing. They're aerobic organisms. They need oxygen to photosynthesize and to create all these different photosynthase that they need. And thus, all the organisms that they partner with are also aerobic. There are some exceptions to this matter, but most of the time they are aerobic. And it's important to note because if you have compaction and you don't have oxygen entering the system because the soil is so compacted and there's no air pockets, what happens is the soil goes anaerobic, which means it loses oxygen. It goes beyond the oxygen level drops to a point where the beneficial organisms can't survive. But there are organisms that are anaerobic that can survive in those systems and or those conditions. And typically those anaerobic organisms tend to be disease causing because their chemical reactions tend to create things like alcohols and terpenes and acids that tend to burn and dissolve plant cell membranes. And what that does, we've probably all experienced root rot. That really ultimately is what it is. It's a system that is waterlogged, that's lacking dissolved oxygen in the water, and aerobic organisms that are creating good structure can't survive, so they die out or go dormant. And anaerobic organisms thrive, and they basically start creating acids and alcohols that dissolve the plant root hairs and allow pathogens to get into the plant. And that can obviously create detrimental, can cause detrimental yields and can affect your plant and make them sick. And often they come with foul smells. And so if ever you smell something in the garden that just doesn't smell right, that usually is a sign. It's like that is anaerobic. That's not really conducive to an aerobic condition. And the organisms not only they don't only live on the plant and on the root surface and the soil, they also live on the plant surfaces. So on the left, far left here is an electron microscope image of a leaf surface. And you can see some stomata, but really what we're seeing here are all these different organisms and fungal hyphae that are living on the plant surface. So in a balanced ecosystem, the plants aren't just denuded, they're not just exposed to the air, they're covered in a soil food in a food web, in a soil food web, basically. And so if you have a disease-causing spore or bacteria that lands on your plant, it doesn't actually land on the leaf surface. It lands on this layering of biology that tend to outcompete and inhibit and consume all these disease-causing organisms. But what happens in conventional agriculture, for example, is we tend to spray all these synthetic fertilizers and synthetic fungicides and such. And what happens is you kill all the beneficial organisms on the plant surface and it becomes denuded. And so in the center fold here, in the center image here, you'll see a denuded plant surface that has one type of bacteria that's covering, a lot of the surface. And the bacteria is then able to proliferate with very little competition, and that ends up showing up to our eyes as an infestation or as a disease. So things like powdery mildew or sooty mold, when you start to see it with the naked eye, that's billions and billions of organisms that have just spread without any inhibition or competition. So it's telling you that, oh, I don't have a balanced soil food web because the plant isn't covered in this diverse biology that's able to inhibit all these diseases. One other thing that the soul food web does is manage nutrient cycling. So if we go back to what plants produce, the photosynthetics, right? The carbohydrates, the sugars, the proteins, if you take a little bit of all that and mix it together, I mean, that's a recipe for cakes and cookies. I like using that analogy because, Dr. Lane used that often and it makes a lot of sense. So the plants create all these different cakes and cookies and spread them out on their plant and root surfaces. And what they're doing with that is they are attracting different organisms to those different sites on them so that they can have the different exchanges necessary with these organisms. So, and this is very pH specific. So let's take a step back here and think about that. So this diagram here on the top right is how different elements are accessible to our plants at different pHs. So we know, for example, your plants need an acidic environment to be able to absorb iron or for it to be bioavailable. Now, why is it that if you go to, say, our native ecosystems in Florida, where our soils are primarily alkaline because they're based on lime rock, why is it that in the wild, plants don't have an iron deficiency, but the soil is alkaline? And that's because the plants have a partnership with fungi that create these micro pHs in the soil and along the root surfaces that are acidic. So the fungi are able to mine for iron in a predominantly alkaline soil. At a microscopic level, they're able to create acidic pHs, mine for the iron, and exchange it with the plants. So your plants don't have an iron deficiency. And that's how smart they are. They're able to go to the organisms and say, I need 5 milligrams of molybdenum, or I need 10 milligrams of boron. These are very specific nutrients. It's very hard for us to tell exactly what a plant needs, but it genetically knows what it needs. As long as it's in a balanced soil food web and can actually have those symbiotic communications with these organisms. So that's really important to know. Another thing to talk about here is predation. So not all organisms have these direct symbiotic relationships with plants. Often what happens is these organisms are going about their day mining for these minerals and the silica layers of the sand, silts, and clays, all these minerals and elements that are bound in the sand, silt, and clay. So bacteria are able to mine for them at like alkaline pHs, and fungi can mine for them at acidic pHs. And what they do is they bind them into their own bodies, and they don't necessarily give them right away to the plants. This is where predators come in. This is where the upper trophic layers of the soil food web are so important, because the predators will come and eat the fungi and eat the bacteria and basically poop out bioavailable minerals and nutrients for these plants. So this is why we also call it the poop loop. And it's kind of a funny name, but it's true. It's fecal matter that's being processed over and over in the system. So as soon as these predators create fecal matter, it is a bioavailable form that the plants can suck up. Not all of it is sucked up, though. Some of it is also redigested and re-decomposed by other fungi and other bacteria. And what happens over time is this diagram in the center here talks about the nitrogen cycle. So whatever minerals are not processed through a plant are actually recycled through other fungi and other bacteria. And as this happens over and over again, the nitrogen gets bound in more and more complex molecules, and we call these fulvic acids and humic acids. So these are very complex and very hard to break apart molecules, and they have a very high carbon content based on chemically speaking. And this is why it's so important to have a balanced soil food web for carbon sequestration. So when it comes to climate science, we're seeing that the soil is one of our most important carbon sinks, because if we're able to have these fungi and these organisms cycle the nitrogen and cycle the carbon over and over again and create these complex humic acids, we're able to sequester more and more carbon over time and store it in a very stable form in the soil, where it's not getting gassed off and ending up in the atmosphere. Right here on the bottom left, I just want to show there's a root feeding nematode. So nematodes are part of the system. Root feeding nematodes, many of us have heard of, and they are detrimental to our crops and to our plants because they will feed on the roots and drastically reduce yields. And typically what people do is they'll solarize. So they'll cover the ground with black plastic and basically bake the soil to kill the root feeding nematodes. And that can be a way to kill root feeding nematodes. But on the right here, you'll see a predatory nematode. So it's larger than a root feeding nematode, and they will feed on massive amounts of root feeding nematodes and keep their numbers in check. But if you solarize, you're killing the predatory nematodes as well. And so you're basically removing the resilience from the system by doing something like that. And there are certain conditions where that might be relevant, but most of the time if you have an issue like root feeding nematodes, that's basically saying you don't have a balanced soil food web because you don't have enough predators keeping their numbers in check. So this slide's really cool, and I want to talk about succession for a second and how it's relevant to our gardens. So we're all gardening in some level of succession. So succession talks about the evolution of an ecosystem over time. And it talks about a complexifying of an ecosystem over time. And so ecosystems tend to start off with bare bedrock, and over time they weather and erode, and it takes hundreds of years usually, because there's not a lot of organisms helping out. And eventually you get lichens and you get moss, and then you get, annual weeds, and eventually it turns into perennials and then shrubs and then trees, and then you end up with forests. So this is the evolution of how ecosystems evolve over time. And as this happens, really what the driving force here is the microbiology. So it's not just the plants coming in, because if you were to plant a tree in bedrock, it wouldn't necessarily grow as efficiently as it could, say, if you planted it in nice, deep, rich, loamy soil. So what's happening there is there's a bacterial to fungal ratio at play. And really what is happening is it's going back to that nitrogen cycle I was talking about earlier. So nitrogen is cycled in two primary forms in the soil. There's nitrate and ammonium. There's a lot of biochemistry here, so I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible. But bacteria process nitrogen in the form of nitrates, and fungi process nitrogen in the form of ammonium. Now, different plants prefer nitrate over ammonium depending on their biochemistry. So more complex plants, such as trees and conifers, actually prefer ammonium because it's a more complex molecule and they need it to produce the complex lignins and structures to have their strong, plant structures. But things like annual weeds or simpler organisms can't process ammonium. They don't have the chemistry to do that. They can process nitrate much more efficiently. So the context of this in our gardens is, if you're wanting to, you need to understand where you are in succession. And it's important to know that, because if you want to plant pine flatwoods, and you're planting your trees, your pine trees, and you're getting a lot of weeds, that's telling you that there's more nitrate in the soil, and so more bacteria in the soil than fungi. Because if you had more fungi that had the partnerships with the pine trees, you would have more ammonium and you'd have less weeds. So that's really important to know. And it's just a sign. It's just a sign of what we need to do to shift the system in one way or another. So it begs the question here. So, okay, the Earth is billions of years old. So why isn't everything at this point a forest, right? Like, why do we still have, lower successional ecosystems? And that's because of disturbance. So one thing that we're very familiar with in Florida is wildfires. So wildfire is a form of disturbance. It pulls succession back into an earlier stage. And other things like disturbance are, clear cutting, or in our gardens, it could be exposing the soil, or removing plants, or walking on an area, or spraying a fungicide. That pulls succession back into an earlier stage where you have more bacteria and less fungi, and thus more nitrates and less ammonium. Now, you might want to grow an earlier successional, wildflower meadow, and you don't want a lot of ammonium because you don't want a lot of trees to sprout in your meadow. So it's really important just to know, like, there's no right or wrong here. It's more which stage of succession do I want to be in, and how do I manage the biology so that I don't need to be fighting it all the time. I can actually work with the biology and make sure I'm creating conditions for either fungi or bacteria to grow, and then the plants just do their thing, and I don't have to worry too much about it. This is another form of the same diagram. It talks about the different types of plants that grow and the different fungal to bacterial ratios. The image down here at the bottom also shows mycorrhizal colonization. So mycorrhiza are a type of fungi that have direct partnerships with specific plants. It's important to note, though, because if you want things, so this is a pine seedling that has a very simple root system, but the network we're seeing here is the fungal network. The pine seedling does not have the capability to have such a vast root system yet, but the mycorrhizae do. So they have a partnership with the seedling to actually exchange and give it all the nutrients it needs in exchange for carbohydrates. So one thing to note here, for example, is mycorrhizae cannot compete with actinobacteria, which brassicas, for example, in vegetable gardens love actinobacteria because they don't like mycorrhizae. So there's all these different interactions and relationships that we just need to understand to know, like, do I want to grow brassicas or do I want to grow pine trees? And which path do I want to kind of maintain with the disturbance that I want to introduce? So to jump into how we can start to apply all of this, right? I love this picture here. It shows a mycelial network. It's the kind of root network of a fungus, or in this case, a mushroom. So a mushroom is a reproductive organ or reproductive part of fungi. And I love this picture because it shows how small the fungi are, how small the mushrooms are, excuse me, and how they slowly get bigger and bigger. And you can actually see the little shapes at a microscopic level and they get larger. So this is, by the time it's, visible to the naked eye, I mean, it's massive compared to how it started. And this is a very complex organism. So the first step of what we can do in our gardens is observe and observe succession, like we were saying, but also observe, like if you see a mushroom, look at everything happening under the root, under the soil surface that we can't see with the naked eye for a mushroom like that to come up. So it's very important to note these things so that we can start taking important steps and the right steps to garden more efficiently. Um, and we'll talk about some of these decompacting, protecting our soil and such. So decompaction, going back to soil structure, it's one of the most important things to do, especially in urban context or in any context, really. And this is one reason people till. So tilling is a way to decompact the soil. Basically, you're breaking up compaction layers and you're introducing oxygen into the system and allowing water to pass through. The problem with over-tilling over time is it creates compaction layers under where you till, and it also breaks up all these aggregates in the soil, and you expose all the organisms to the sun and to the UV rays, and they just die over time, and it just decreases the biology over time and the diversity. So tilling is a way to do it, but there's a better way in our gardens, and it's decompacting lightly. So using something like a broad fork or a garden fork, and doing this maybe once or twice, and just kind of like opening up the soil, but not exposing it and tilling and turning all the soil and breaking it all up. So you want to have as minimal disturbance as possible. But if you do have a compaction layer, one fast way is to break it up, introduce biology into the system, but then not over till it so that you're actually killing more biology than you're introducing. One other thing is covering the soil. One reason we mulch is to protect these organisms from UV rays and from rain. So think like a raindrop can cause compaction on exposed soil. And you think, well, how's a tiny little raindrop causing compaction? But think of the trillions of raindrops that'll fall on an area. That creates a lot of pressure that actually creates compaction layers deeper in the soil that we can't even see unless we test for them. So we use a tool like this on the bottom left picture. It's a penetrometer. So we actually measure that PSI that I was talking about. So if anything's above 150 or even 300, that's saying there's compaction layers that need to be broken up and biology is not, there's not enough biology doing its job. So adding mulch is a great way to buffer that pressure and to alleviate the incessant compaction that can happen from things like rain. But the best mulch is really living plants. Because if you have a ground cover, those plants are creating exudates and they're perpetuating biology in a much more active way than just plain old mulches. That's just, eventually is food for the organisms, but really what you want is plants because they're creating food and creating exudates and perpetuating the system much more efficiently. And also one other thing is avoiding synthetic fertilizers and sprays because what those do is they kill biology downright. As soon as you spray a synthetic fertilizer or a synthetic spray, you kill all the biology. Hands down. This has been shown time and time again. Why would we do that? If you do have an outbreak of a disease, take two steps back and look at why is this happening? Is there a better way to approach this? Do I need to eradicate and completely sterilize the system and pull my system further back in succession than where it is? Like, you gotta look at these things and really consider them in the garden. And they apply over the entire general landscape. One great thing I like asking people to do or encouraging them to do is sheet mulching. So a lot of us have lawns, and a lot of us are working on removing our monoculture lawns and replacing them with um, native meadows or native ecosystems. And it's backbreaking work, removing lawn, ripping it up. And in some contexts, that is necessary, but in a lot of contexts, you can do something like sheet mulching. So instead of killing your lawn and exposing that soil to the atmosphere and to the UV rays and killing even more organisms, or doing something like solarizing, you can put down an occlusion layer. So burlap, cardboard, wetting it, putting down compost, and covering it with mulch and planting. And that will, most of the time, effectively kill all the weeds and kill all the grass. And that's a great way to actually create a new garden space without ripping up lawn. It is work, but it ultimately could end up in a it pushes succession further along much faster than ripping the grass. And here's an example. The center pictures here, when I lived in Australia, um, this was a median strip that was sprayed down with Roundup. And I didn't realize it was sprayed down with Roundup initially until I saw them doing it. And it was like concrete. There was mulch, but the mulch was like concrete. I would water this and I couldn't even get my fork into it. It was so dense. So what I did was sheet mulch. I'm like, the only thing I can do is sheet mulch at this point and plant plants. So I watered it as much as I could. It puddled and took maybe 2 days to drain down. It was a horrible situation. And I got free horse manure. I got free cardboard. I laid it all down and I covered it with free mulch. And I planted seedlings. And 6 months later, it looked like the photo on the right. There is no way those plants would have made it if I didn't sheet mulch. Because what I did with the horse manure and the sheet mulching and the mulch was I introduced biology into the system. And they went about over 6 months breaking up compaction layers so that after the fact I could go in with my hand and actually dig down, and I was able to actually dig down into the soil. And the plants were able to perpetuate that by continuing that whole system. So sheet mulching is awesome, and I always encourage it. This is a recent case study I did for my next door neighbor. He had a strip in the front that was native pink muhly grass that we all love, but it was a monoculture of muhly grass. And, there's different steps we had to take. So even though it was native muhly grass, it wasn't really doing them any favors. It was the wrong plant for the wrong place, and it didn't have much diversity in terms of fauna that was associated to it either. And it was planted with weed barrier underneath. So whoever had done this had put weed barrier down, and then they planted muley into it. And we wanted a much nicer front. So we did observation. We looked at all these different conditions. I designed a nice, diverse, it was like 99% native. There's maybe a couple non-natives in there. And this is in Southeast Florida. And there was a bit of work. Instead of just ripping out and planting right into the weed barrier, we took some time to demo. I ripped out all the weed barrier. There's a lot of microplastics left over from that, which just breaks down into all these little microplastics. And I did what I thought was the right thing and ripped out it took us a couple hours, and we cleaned up the system, leveled it out, and then we laid compost and we laid burlap down, and we planted right into that. We cut the burlap and planted into it and covered it with really high quality mulch. And then we had one of the worst rains we had that year, and it didn't wash away because we had burlap down and we had really a nice thick layer of mulch, and the plants survived, and we had no casualties, which is amazing. And now this garden, 3 months later, is looking at like the bottom photo, and it's thriving, and there's um, insects and butterflies and all these different fauna that weren't there before that are thriving. Yeah, partnering with biology and kind of taking 2 steps back, figuring out where we need to be in succession, and taking the right steps to protect the soil biology. And as soon as we put the compost down, we covered it so that we're not losing all this biology to being exposed to the atmosphere and the UV rays and all that. So, compost is one way that we introduce biology. You're probably wondering, well, how do I get biology into my garden? So compost is the way we do it. At the Soul Food Web School, we're taught how to make proper compost. And the best compost is thermal compost. And I used to be the type that would tell everyone, everyone needs to compost, everyone needs to do this. And then when I studied it professionally, I'm like, no one needs to be composting because you need to know how to do it properly. Because otherwise, you could be perpetuating and spreading pathogens into your garden. So I do encourage people to get into composting, but there's right and wrong ways to do it. When you're talking thermal composting, there's very specific recipes you have to follow. There's specific temperatures you have to reach. And unless you're really into it, I tend to encourage people to either purchase really good compost or do different things like vermicomposting, which is composting with earthworms, or static composting, which takes a long time, takes usually a year to yield, but you end up with a much safer compost than if you're just doing it haphazardly on the short term. We use things like thermometers, like these large thermometers to kind of measure the temperature and stuff. And this could be inaccessible to some people. And so it's important to figure out resources. And I have some resources to share at the end. Compost extract and teas are also super important. So you probably heard of making teas and things like that. And we make aerobic teas where we're brewing and introducing oxygen to the system. We never make teas that are static where things go rancid or where they're sitting in a bucket for several days without oxygen and it smells horrible. That's basically perpetuating pathogens most of the time. And so we encourage people to do extracts because these are, ways to spread biology without actually physically putting compost down in high volumes. You can actually take your small amount of compost and make an extract out of it or a tea and spray it onto your plants and onto your soil and cover a much larger area, but there are specific recipes to follow. So one thing, to get into this pretty briefly, just because I get asked so much about it, is these countertop composters, and I put it in between quotations because they're not really composting, but I do like these systems. I have used them, and I do encourage people to do this. And I have used a Vitamix and a Wrinkle myself, and I know someone that has a mill. These are just some of the many that are on the market. I'm not endorsing these necessarily, but what they do is they basically grind down and dehydrate your food waste, which is what typically you would put in compost or a home composting system. But what it does is it eliminates a lot of the issues that we deal with home composting, which is too much water in a system or things going moldy or attracting vermin and things like that. And what these do is I do like them, and I could have a whole presentation on these, which I won't get into too much detail, but I do encourage you to look into these. They do have a higher cost up front, but if you do want to get into composting at a home scale, this is a great option. If you have garden space or, even if you're working in pots, you can store the materials that come out of these systems. It basically reduces the volume like a tenth of what it was and removes all the water. So you're dehydrating and preserving the food waste, and then it doesn't go moldy. And then you can save that and either give it to someone that has a garden or spread it in your garden very lightly, and it doesn't end up being moldy and weird. And you're also not having to deal with a compost bin that you're having to manage continually. Other resources that I can share are the Soul Food Web School directly. They have courses that are amazing. They actually currently have like a 48% discount on one of their big courses, and it's a permaculture course attached to it as well. And I think that's going on for another 2.5 days or so. So definitely, if you're interested, take a look at that. It's a great deal. Soul Life Organics, Alan Skinner, he's in Jacksonville. He's awesome. He's our Florida Soul Food Web certified Soul Food Web consultant, and he's a wealth of knowledge, and he's in the Jacksonville area, and he um, services clients in that area and does workshops, and he's a great resource to connect with, and you can likely source awesome compost through him. And then Renewable, I've done testing for them. They work out of the Tampa area and Southeast Florida, and Xavier there is amazing, very knowledgeable, and they make great compost if you're in that area. And they also do landscape consulting and native garden and vegetable garden installations and stuff. So he's awesome in Florida. And then Catalyst Bioamendments, they're based out of California, but they do travel around a lot. The lower photo here are windrows that they made, and they do commercial scale composting, and they make probably some of the best composts in the world. And they were recently in Florida, and they brought their big turner over, and they kind of trucked it across the country, and were able to make biocomplete, amazing compost for their clients in Florida. So if you do have larger tracts of land and if you do have the budget for that, they're an amazing resource to hire, and they know, exactly what they're doing. So these are awesome resources to connect with if you want to source good compost for your garden. And it's important to note here, sourcing compost from your local area. So Catalyst, for example, sells their compost and you can purchase it, but they're in California and they're making it in California. And I don't necessarily encourage people to purchase from them for Florida because there's no guarantee that any of those organisms are going to survive in our climate because we have very different weather and climate than them. So ideally you're sourcing your compost and making your compost locally so that you can cultivate the native and indigenous organisms that have the very specific partnerships with your native local plants. So that's really important to note. Couple last things before we jump into Q&A. So this is something that I just wanted to mention. It's really important when you are purchasing compost, and you'll notice this if you purchase something from a big box store, because I don't usually like recommending big box stores. They don't really know what they're doing, and they're usually sourcing things for an entire nation when it's not appropriate to your local region. And I'd like to make a distinction here, like how if you see these things in a sample that you get or in a soil that you purchase or a compost that you purchase. So these are really important to note. So beneficial fungi look like what's on the far left here. They look like clear networks and root systems of um, of a fungal mycelium. So this is basically what good fungi looks like. It's got clear, strong bonds and a clear web and network. What's in the middle here is very fuzzy wuzzy, what we call it. It's very fuzzy. It's got interesting colors in it. It looks like mold. It doesn't have a clear structure like on the left, which is like a clear network. And that is basically saying that whatever's in that sample or whatever's in that compost is not fully decomposed. It's probably gone anaerobic because mold tends to be that. And then what's on the far right is actinobacteria. So if you ever open a compost pile, or if you ever open a bag of soil and you get this white cast, it's like this white powder. It doesn't look like big fuzzy mold, but it looks like a white powder. That's actinobacteria. It's not actually mold. It's not fungi. It's a type of bacteria that is filamenticious under the microscope. So it's like long filaments, but they are kind of on the cusp. So they're not anaerobic and they're not aerobic. They're kind of in between, but they're telling us that the system is likely going anaerobic. So it's going into a kind of a detrimental path. And so what you need to do in that case is introduce oxygen into the system. Now, if you have actinobacteria and you're growing things like brassicas, they like that because actinobacteria suppresses mycorrhizal fungi, which brassicas don't like. So just things to note here and distinctions to be aware of. You want to see what's on the far left and you don't want to see what's in the middle. So that pretty much concludes the the presentation. I know I covered so much ground. I have some common questions here if there's no Q&A, but I'll let Emily or the rest of the team jump in if we want to jump right to the Q&A, or if I can cover some of these quick questions if we want to get it going.
All right. Thank you so much. That was incredible. And like you said, covered so much ground. I know I could probably watch it like 5 more times to really absorb a lot of that information. We don't have any Q&A right now, so I just remind everybody, if you have a question, please pop it in the Q&A. I actually have a question about compaction and sheet mulching, so I'm going to kick it off. Because I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. If you have a really compacted soil environment and you sheet mulch over it, what I'm understanding you to say is that that sheet mulching area that isn't compacted, the things that move into that will actually be able to decompact the soil layer beneath it. Is that
Oh,
correct?
yeah, so over time, so I'm going to move back here and show you um, the image of me with a garden fork on the right here. So ideally what you want to do is you want to start to break up those compaction layers and start kicking the system into gear. So when you introduce the sheet mulching elements, you're not just layering stuff on compaction, because if you it might, depending on your situation, it might take years for stuff to decompact on its own, or you might be putting down compost that doesn't have everything necessary, and so it's going to take a long time for these organisms to proliferate to the point where they actually start decompacting your soil. So it's important to decompact as much as you can. So what I did here is I was forking and slowly lifting the soil, not actually turning it and not stepping back over the area that I was decompacting, and kind of working my way back. And then we laid everything from the side and just kind of like laid it all. And I like to also water to make sure that I've decompacted efficiently. So if I know that it's still pooling, I've probably not decompacted enough, So there's, yeah, definitely over time, to answer your question, it will decompact, but depends how long you want to wait.
Okay. So we do have a few questions coming in. Can you expand a little bit more on the problems that it can occur with home composting?
Yeah, so um I've done it all. I've used turners, I have done composting bins, I've done vermicomposting. Florida is notorious. We have palmetto bugs. We have, it's a kind of a year-round seasonal moment where you're dealing with things year-round, which is awesome for gardening, but then you can deal with a lot of you have to manage like all the water we get in the summer. Like it can get very wet. So composting is its own I would say it can be a whole weekend talking about composting where we can do like demonstrations and things like that. But when it comes to home composting, typically people they'll use a bin. And the issue with that is you don't get enough oxygen in the system. You need maximum oxygen flow. And I'll show you the photo here of how we make our piles. We use these hardware cloth mesh that has air pockets all around it. So you're letting oxygen go through. The other thing that can happen with home composting systems is it's not turned fast enough or it's not turned correctly. So I have temperatures listed here. And as soon as a pile reaches a certain temperature for a certain period of time, it then needs to be turned because if it reaches temperatures too high, so I'll delve a little bit here. How does the temperature rise in a compost pile? Like, what is that? And what that is it's actually bacteria and biology going about their reproduction and going about their respiratory, respiration, and they actually create heat through their activities. And that is what increases the temperature in a pile. So it's organisms living and breathing and doing all their thing. Now, if the temperature gets too high, that is basically saying that there's a huge proliferation of organisms and they're going to use up all the free oxygen that's all around them. And then what's gonna happen is the system's gonna go anaerobic because you've lost all your oxygen, and these organisms are going to die, or they're gonna go dormant. And then you're going to get anaerobic organisms that take their place. And so all of a sudden you have pathogens when you had beneficial organisms to start with. And then you're working with this, and you could get things like E. coli, you can get things like spirochetes and spirilla, and all these different like disease-causing organisms that you're breathing in. And that's why it's really, really important. If you want to get into composting, I highly encourage that, but make sure you're doing it in a healthy way. Get a compost thermometer and measure those temperatures. And there's a way we turn the piles where the center of the pile gets put to the outside and the outside gets put right to the center. So you're composting, evenly across the whole pile. And once it reaches certain plateau temperatures, we know it's done and then we can use it safely. And another thing is get in touch with a local Soul Food Web lab technician. I'm not currently in Florida. I'm road tripping the US for 6 months, but there are other people that you can send your compost to and they can test it for you. And they can tell you if there's pathogens in it, if you should or shouldn't be using it based on what you're trying to grow. Because the final result of compost is really what? It's compost has nutrients in it. People call compost a fertilizer, right? It's not really a fertilizer, it's a soil amendment. It can be used as a fertilizer because it has some free bioavailable nutrients in it, but its most important job is as an inoculant. We're using it to inoculate the soil and our plants with good biology. And so if you have the right balance, you're doing the right thing. And really, what is the balance there is the fungal to bacterial ratio, like I was talking about before. Depending on what you're trying to grow, you'll know based on what level of succession those plants are in, what balance of fungal to bacterial ratio you need. And then you'll know what kind of compost to apply. So if you need a very high fungal ratio and your compost doesn't have enough fungi, you need to source fungi from somewhere else to balance that out. So there's all these different nuances that go into it, and there's courses on it, and I highly encourage people to get into it. But also be careful not to just kind of willy-nilly go about it and then spread pathogens and make your family sick, in the process. So, you
If
know.
your compost has gone bad, is there any way to save it or is it just a lost cause?
Yeah, so actually that's one thing I didn't cover here. I'm glad someone asked about this. This photo in the bottom right, I say 70% cocoa chocolate brown. One way you know that your compost has gone bad too is from the color. So often people call it like black gold. And actually, if you have a black color in your compost, that's not a good thing. Because what that means, and to answer the question up front, I'll say it can be used, but typically what we would do is we would recompost it correctly, or we would use it as a food source for something, say, like vermicomposting, where it gets composted correctly. So to delve into this a bit more, why 70% chocolate brown? And I do encourage people literally to go get a chocolate brown, 70% chocolate brown bar and put it up against different samples that they're wanting to purchase and compare. Because if it's black, what does that mean? When nitrogen, when a compost goes anaerobic, like I was saying, the nitrogen or the nitrates or the ammonium that's in the compost goes through an anaerobic chemical reaction through all the different anaerobic organisms, and it leaves the system. It gases off as ammonia. And what ammonia leaves behind is a black residue when it gases off. So what's that saying is when you have a black compost, like really dark color, darker than 70% chocolate brown, it means a lot of your nutrients and your nitrogen are gone. They're not in that system anymore. They've been gassed off because at some point that compost went anaerobic. So that's really important to know, to see, like that's a visual cue to understand like the quality of a product. It should be 70% chocolate brown. And then it can be recomposted if it's gone bad. So either you do a proper thermal compost or you let it sit for a long period of time, like in a static pile, like for a year, and you let organisms do their thing over a long period of time. Or you do something like vermicomposting. So vermicomposting is really cool because what worms essentially are is they're a tube with a digestive system and they're full of organisms. They're full of bacteria and other organisms. And worms will basically eat anything that fits in their mouth, which is, and they're large organisms when we're talking about the soil. So they'll eat almost everything in the soil. And um, what happens is if you have pathogens in your compost or your soil, the worms will eat that. And as it passes through their digestive system, it'll get outcompeted and consumed by all the organisms inside the worm. And what comes out is really clean fecal matter that is high in bioavailable nutrients and it doesn't have pathogens in it. The problem with vermicompost, though, is you tend to have lower fungal numbers because worms have big mouths and they'll eat the fungi and they'll eat all the mycelium. And so you end up over time with less fungal population. So it's important after vermicompost, if you need a higher fungal population, to introduce them from other sources. And to talk about that really briefly, because I didn't mention in the presentation, is how do you source good fungal, indigenous fungal um, populations, right? You can purchase online, and there's a lot of places you can purchase stuff online. You get all these mixes of organisms and bacteria and stuff, and it's hard to know where they were sourced. And I always encourage people to go for their indigenous native organisms. And I like to source them from native ecosystems. Now, this is where, ethical questions come into play and, the ethical harvest, and understanding like how much am I harvesting and stuff. But we're talking tablespoons of soil here or tablespoons of leaf litter. And I always encourage people to check rules and make sure going on, doing anything illegal by going on public property and stealing soil or going on someone's private property, or ask permission ahead of time if you can do that. But find as pristine as possible native ecosystems that mimic the kind of ecosystem you're trying to recreate. Because you know that if those systems are perpetuating without fertilizers and tilling and spraying, and they're doing their own thing, that those organisms that you need are in there, and you can source them from there. And you can collect teaspoons and tablespoons from different areas under and around the different plants that you want to grow or similar plants that you want to grow, and inoculate your piles and inoculate your soil with those organisms. So yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. Another question about sheet mulching. Can you talk about the different options for what you use as a layer? So you mentioned cardboard and what was the other thing you mentioned?
Burlap.
Burlap. Someone is asking if you can use cotton sheets or blankets.
I have seen people do that. Most important thing is using something that will biodegrade, that doesn't have plastic in it. So anything that's biodegradable, I've seen people use cloth. I've seen people use burlap. So I personally prefer burlap over, say, cardboard. I've used both, but cardboard is hard to source sometimes. You want to make sure it doesn't have plastic. or or like a lot of staples in it. It's kind of hard to manage. It'll fly away. You need to wet it. It's kind of a process. Burlap comes in rolls. It's low volume. It's easy to lay out, and I use simple landscape pins to put it in place. Cloth works just as well. Cloth will take a while to decompose. So if you can source cloth that is not synthetic, that is, pure cotton or pure, a natural material, yeah, you can use that. And it'll just take time to decompose if that's what you want. But the most important thing with sheet mulching too is understanding like you see the sea of mulch here in the middle left photo. I mean, I started off that way because I didn't have a lot of plants at the time. I had a few seeds. But really, ultimately, we want to cover everything with plants, as much as possible. Um, it's important to note here, obviously, the ecosystem we're trying to grow. Like a lot of our native ecosystems don't necessarily have mulch, right? They have exposed soil or exposed sand, and sand is a form of mulch in some areas, where under the layers of sand, you'll have organic matter that's growing and the roots are thriving under that. So it's important to like understand like what do I want this to ultimately look like? In the context of this case study, we were growing mostly hammock plants, understory plants, and things that can have, a mulch layer around them or need a higher organic matter. So it's important to know these things. But yeah, cloth, anything biodegradable, anything that's easy to access and manageable for you, works totally fine.
Okay, great. So we got one more question and then we'll wrap this up. We've gone a few minutes over, but we're doing great on time. We have a question about using chickens for composting. I'm assuming they mean chicken waste. So maybe you could just talk for a minute about animal compost in general, whether it's cow,
Yeah.
chicken, whatever.
So chickens are used in systems to process food scraps where they will eat the food scraps and the manure that comes out is manure that is used as a fertilizer. So actually chickens are a way to compost if you have the capacity and means to do that. They're great. And when we're making thermal compost, the recipe that I was talking about, the carbon to nitrogen ratio and stuff, we actually include manure in there as a high nitrogen source to kick the system and into high gear initially and get it going. And chicken manure can be used as that. Chicken manure on its own is really strong, and you have to be kind of cautious of that. And one thing to mention here is alternate forms of manure, like say horse manure. Depending, like a lot of people may have access to horse manure, but for example, horses often are treated with dewormer, which will ultimately kill all your nematodes in your compost and in your soil if you apply that to the soil. So it's important to know where you're sourcing your material from and what your chickens were fed, for example, or what your horses were treated with, because you want a balanced nematode. You want all the predatory and fungal feeding nematodes and stuff, not just the you don't want to kill all of those. And so it's important to know the sources of things. But yeah, chickens are great if you have the space and capacity to deal with them. But then using their manure itself, it needs to be diluted and kind of spread and kind of mixed with other things before it's applied to the soil because
They
it's very high in nitrogen.
followed that question up with it sounds like maybe they were asking actually about using chickens to till the soil.
Yeah, so I've worked when I lived in Australia, the farm that I was working on, we used chickens to prepare areas ahead of reforestation and ahead of prepping vegetable gardens. So they kind of had them in cells, and we would move the chickens. We'd leave them there for a week and then move them on to the next system. Chickens are great because they will eat a lot of pests. They will naturally scratch and kind of like surface till in a very, very non-disruptive way, and they'll eat a lot of weeds and weed seeds. So they're an awesome system. I plan on having chickens in the future because they're great. But it depends on the kind of ecosystem you're wanting to introduce after the chickens are out of the area, because chickens produce a very high nitrogen manure. High nitrogen equals high bacteria, high nitrates, which means probably more weedy species, not high fungal ammonium species like trees and shrubs and stuff. So it's just an important thing to distinguish there. Like they'd be great ahead of an early successional wildflower or early successional vegetable situation, not necessarily like trees and shrubs and having an area with a lot of fungi.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much. This has all been just incredibly fascinating. And for everyone who's still on, as we mentioned before, we will make the recording available within about 48 hours. So keep an eye on your inbox for that link, as well as links to other resources that Gio mentioned.
Yeah.
So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Gio, for that wonderful presentation. And we hope to see you out in the field on one of our trips coming up in May. Have a great
Yeah.
afternoon, everybody.
Thanks for coming on and thanks for having me. I appreciate you all.